Shalom, happy Sabbath to you. You're with Church One Ypsilanti. We are on part three. Yes, you heard it. Part three of what happens during the emergency process or the time of trouble. Today we are on foods. Our first part was on just what to expect in general. The second was on money, but today is on food. And I just want to warn you before we even get started that there are a lot of different ways that you can approach the food situation, and this is what God has given me over this week. And I just want you to first go ahead and get your notepad, your pen. You can get your Bible. You might even want to get a dictionary today, because there's some definitions. Matter of fact, I'll leave the definitions to you today because I don't want the message to be too long. That way we could all stay focused, and we want to get what God has for us, but also we want to be warned about some things. And so that warning is going to be very important because we want to make sure that we are warned. It says the devil is a roaring like a singing to whom he may devour. And because of that, we want to make sure that we are warning you on some of the things in the food environment that I believe and God has shown me that the devil is using, so that even in our storage process, even in our emergency process, even in this time of trouble that we find ourselves in, uh, we can utilize this time to uh, make sure that we're centered on the approach that we have. Now, I'm Pastor Rob, and Pastor Lexi, our associate pastor. We're here and we have studied the word to make sure that we're centering ourselves on how to move forward in this region of time that we find ourselves on. Not going to explain why we said that we're in a little bit of trouble. Can't call this the time of trouble yet, but a little bit of trouble, at least for 3 to 6 months. And we talked about that in parts one and two, and we don't want to go over that again. So if you haven't seen those parts, uh, feel free to go over those parts. Today, we're talking about the storage of food and why it's important. And today is why Egypt stored food. That's found in Genesis 41. I'm just going to give you the Cliff Note version, but you can go to Genesis 41 and read the whole thing for yourself. And one of the things that uh, catapulted me about this, and I just want to kind of paraphrase again, is that the Pharaoh was having dreams. And as he was having dreams, uh, there was 7 years. I'm sorry, there were ears of corn that were a set of seven that were good, and then there was a set of seven that were skinny and frail, and they enveloped the other 7 years. And as you begin to go through it, you will understand that the king had to call on someone to make sure that he interpreted his dream. Now, the person that he called on was Joseph. And as he began to call on Joseph, Joseph listened to what the king was saying about his dreams and was able to interpret his dreams when no one else, the soothsayers, the mediums, the sorcerers, they were not able to interpret his dreams. And so during this time, as he's interpreted a dream, it comes to pass that Joseph is able to tell the Pharaoh what his dream meant and what he needed to do. And here's what I have to say to you before I even go into the fact that we want to store our foods for at least 3 months. And now I'm praying, and the Lord is putting on my heart to put out there 7 years, but 3 months for sure. Uh, is because before we go into that, I want to make sure that you know that Joseph was put in that spot for a time as such that was needed, meaning he had already been through the things he needed to go through. he had already weathered the storm. Matter of fact, if you read the story, you know that the king called him from jail, and they had to basically uh shave him up, give him some new clothes even before he came to the, and perfume him up even before he came to the king. And so there may be some of God's people out there who are going through some atrocities. And these atrocities have occurred because of a path that God put you on. And this is what I want to say to you spiritually. God put you on that path not because he wanted you just to be in jail, whether that's Facebook jail, whether that's real jail. He put you on those paths because he wanted you to see how people would interact with you when Satan were in control of them. But even though Satan were in control of those people, God still has the ability to set you up to make sure that you're in a position of success. Even what appears to be failure can be success, and that's what I want you to come from with this as a small token of a spiritual nugget. But as we go into our why to store up, I want to give you some warning spots. Now, I'm taking these warning spots very, very seriously because my thought is if you store up poison and you're eating poison over these 3 months, well, your body could be more degraded than it is if you were just fasting, if it were, or your body can be in a worse shape. And so here are some of the things that I want us to pay attention to. And I want to just dive in. Is it okay if I dive in? Hopefully it is. Here are some of the things that I want us to pay attention to. And I want to make sure that you know that these things can be considered foods. And if you do the research on your own, which I'm encouraging you, because today I was prepared to give you definitions and talk, but the Lord is saying to me that you need to know these things. You need to have an intimate understanding of these things that I'm giving you. And this list, let me tell you, is not totally inclusive of all the things I want to tell you. I'm just telling you the latest and greatest. I'm just telling you the latest and greatest of things that are against us out there in our food so that we can be warned about these things. All right. And so here we go. If you don't know this word GMO, it stands for genetically modified organism. Now, in most cases, a genetically modified food does not have seeds. Yes, I said it first. So a genetically modified food does not have seeds. Now, you can go and look at what GMOs do to you. One of the main things that I want to talk about is that genetically modified organisms do not have seeds. So, for instance, if you're eating grapes, if you're eating watermelons that do not have seeds in them, let me let you know that that particular fruit is sterile. And what we know about sterile fruits is that the things that eat them, the animals that eat them, the humans that eat them, they become and or can become sterile. It's the same thing. Humans are, God implores us to be fruitful and multiply. And what do we know about our fruits? We know that we have eggs in the woman and we have sperm in the man. And if those particular things are without seed, well, they can't reproduce. And the other thing about genetically modified organisms is that they can't reproduce after they are produced. And so we want to pay attention to those things because those are foods that are not good for us. Now, listen, we can debate on whether GMOs are good for you or not good for you, but a sustained food diet over 3 months, I guarantee you, they won't be good for you. And so what we want to make sure we're doing is we're not debating on whether they're good or not good. I'm just making sure that I'm doing what the Lord has told me, and that is to make sure that you know about them. The next is flatulates. Flatulates. Flatulates are the backbones in plastics. Now, we know, and this is the main storage. Pastor Rob, listen, I'll just go to Burger King or McDonald's and I'll get some chicken McNuggets and I'll freeze them for 3 months. I'll have the dollar menu on my substance. So if I got 6 people in the house, they both eat 12. Everybody can eat 12 burgers together. We'll do 12 times 30 times 3. That's 3 months, right, Pastor Rob? Yes, it is 3 months. Yes, it is a very simple way to store food. Yes, I get why somebody would do that. And yes, I'm sure that somebody's children, especially those who like chicken McNuggets, why they would like to do this. But let me tell you this about flatulates. Flatulates have been designed, particularly as it relates to fast food, as plastics. And you can do the research yourself. Don't believe me. Plastics and foods. And so the reason that I'm giving you this as an during this emergency time is that I don't want you to go to Burger King or McDonald's, and I'm not talking about them as stores, but I'm talking about what they use in their foods. And I want to be very clear about this. Flatulates are the backbones of plastics. So in most parts, they are plastics. And they are plastics that are placed in foods. And plastics that are placed in foods, according to the NIH, have the high ability to cause high blood pressure and to cause some of the things, the ailments that African Americans specifically have in their comorbidity issues. I'll just leave it there so that no one thinks that I'm talking about medical issues, right? And so I'm talking about food today. The next after flatulates is engineered foods. If you don't know, in 2018, most candies have bioengineered foods in them. So the plastics, the chocolate that you may be tasting, it may not be chocolate. It may be an engineered food. And on top of that, not only is it engineered, it's bioengineered, meaning that there are things that biologically were added to make it taste like that, but also to do other things that we don't quite understand and know about because there's not enough research to see how it will affect our body. So a lot of people, a lot of times when they're storing for that 3 months of preparedness, they are storing Snickers, they're storing M&Ms, they're storing paydays. And listen, I want to be honest. I just had a payday 4 days ago. So yes, I have eaten biologically engineered food, but I don't do it all the time. And I'm saying to store it in your food pantry for 3 months may be a mistake. But I want to make sure that I'm warning you so that you know. Now, why is it important not to have biologically engineered food? And because it's not really food. It's not really food. The other thing is that the bioengineered handles, particularly as it relates to the flatulates, is alcohol. A lot of you have asked me, what do I think about wine, beer, and alcohol? Well, of course, in the situation where I sit as a spiritual leader, I'm saying that in no case is it good for you. But if you do, there are some of the ways that you can make your wines and alcohols. It's called fermentized, or we also know them as probiotics. And do I take probiotics? I take a small amount of probiotics that I actually make out of what's called SCOBY, a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. Now, the last word is going to come to an offense to somebody because we know that yeast is never good for individuals, especially women. And so you'll find that some of the things that have to do with alcohol have a backdraft of yeast in it. So even when it's good, you must make sure that there's a balance in your diet of it. I'm very clear on that. So the yeast that the SCOBY, the symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast, also known as probiotics. So for those people who are out there saying, oh, Pastor Rob is preaching yeast, or he's called symbiotic cultures of bacteria and yeast. If you're eating probiotics, you're eating those things, period. And I want to say this: probiotics are not made from the human body. They are an additive to the human bodies. Any of those human those biomes is what they're called. Write this down, please, because I feel like I'm going fast and I've got a lot that's coming to you. And we'll come down to a simple list, but I want to make sure that you're studying for yourself. The reason that I'm bringing up the flatulates, specifically as it relates to alcohol, specifically as it relates to probiotics, because now they have added different plastics that can be interchangeable as alcohols. Now, as you know, some of these plastics can't be burned. And what we've seen is that even the regular alcohols turn into fats into our bodies. Now, a lot of people will say, well, Pastor Rob, it's good to have a little extra fat in your body during the time of famine. I want to go on record and say, yes, it is good to have a little extra fat. Because if your body has a reserve to burn off of, if you're the leader and somebody else has to eat a little extra because they're malnutrition, then you can depend on your fats. This is true, particularly as it relates to your inner workings of your family and who needs to eat what that day and how many calories they need to get if there's an emergency situation. I want to leave a quiet pause there. If there's an emergency situation. The other thing that I want to talk about, and I'm just leaving these things open because you are the researcher today. And listen, I'm going to tell you how to connect with my church. I'm going to tell you how to connect with Church One Ypsilanti so that if you have further questions, if you want further direction after you look at these definitions and start to understand what we're talking about, that you have the ability to connect with us at all times. Some of the individuals who have been connecting with us on part 1 and 2 have had serious questions, and those questions have led me to tell you more about the food because they're saying, well, can you give us some of the warning spots that we need to have? And so that's what we're doing. The second is cellulose. Now, this is one of the things that are very, very troubling to me. A lot of you know that cellulose is 90% cardboard, right? And I'm not saying that when the FDA says that up to 11 to 15% of cellulose can be in your food, that they're talking about cardboard. No, they're not talking about cardboard. Guess what they're talking about? They're talking about wood chips, steamed up, firmed up, ground it up to powder, and add it to your food as fillers. You can read about it yourself, but it's called cellulose. And so the reason that I'm telling you about these particular foods is because these are foods that are added to our foods, our real foods, that allow our foods to seem more uh, healthy and hearty, when actually these things are artificial. They're not real foods, but the federal government has said that they're real foods. And what do I call real foods? What does Pastor Rob call real foods? Well, as I've studied over the last 11 years, if it does not grow in the wild, it's not a real food. Meaning, if God did not create it, it's not a real food. That's my definition. Now, the federal government has a different definition. We respect their definition, but we have to warn you that their definition may not be as healthy for people as we think. And so we just want to warn you, cellulose is a particular food, a particular additive. And so why am I telling you this? Because as you choose the foods to store up in your storage closet for the 3 months that we've been talking about, we want to make sure that you have a low count of cellulose in your food. We understand that in some neighborhoods, listen, there's a thing called a food desert, right? Which means that a person cannot go to a store and expect to get real food. Now, it used to be that a food desert meant that a person had to walk a particular amount of blocks to get to actual real food. But we know now here in America, and specifically in other advanced countries, not in non advanced countries, but in advanced countries, meaning first world. I hate to use that term, but you know what I mean. You have to walk more than 27 blocks to get to a grocery store. When you finally get to that grocery store in a food desert town, you may not have an option to real food because the foods from suburban areas where individuals are more richer and have a higher quality food source, they pass their bad foods to those areas that are called food deserts. We'll talk about that in a podcast of sorts. But I want to make sure you know that cellulose is one of the things that are in high concentration in our foods. in food, not our foods, but in foods in areas that have food deserts, right? And I want to make sure that you have knowledge of this. The other is CRISPR. It's an acronym, actually, and I want to spell this acronym out for you, and I want you to study it. CRIPR. CRISPR, CRISPR. And it stands for Cluster Regulatory Interspace Short Palindromic Repeats. I'm not going to repeat that because I can't even say that I remember it again. Unless that I go back to the acronym and then I just choose the words based on what it says. But the reason that I want to give you that is because these are foods that are built on frequency. And as you study these foods, the foods that have CRISPR in them, you'll know that these foods are designed as bioweapons. At the end of the day, you'll know that these foods are designed as bioweapons. I'm telling you from my research. Now, you may go in and say, hey, Pastor Rob, these are foods that are designed for people when there's a time of emergency, when we have to have something to eat. And I want to give you a heads up on this already. These foods during the time of emergency, you may hear scientists say that we have foods that are designed from CRISPR. And I want to tell you, anytime that you don't know about something before it comes and they're using it in an emergency time and they're telling you that it's good for you and they're telling you that it will give you the nutrients that you need, but they don't tell you where those nutrients come from, that should be a problem to you. And right now, as I've done research, I've seen that the foods that are designed to have CRISPR in them, we don't know what the CRISPR is, and we don't know where the nutrients are coming from, which means it is something that is hidden. And our Bible tells us to stay away from things that are hidden. If it's something in the dark, we need to stay from it. And that's the most I want to say about it. But to the point, I want to make sure that we're centered on why to stay away from it. We can stay away from it because it could be considered a bioweapon. Now, the last but not least, there are many more. I just wanted to say these because these are the latest that no one is talking about. And that's mRNA inferions. No one is talking about this right now. mRNA inferions are going to replace genetically modified organisms. What? So there is already a replacement for GMO. And in my opinion, my layman professional opinion. That's funny, layman and professional, right? Because I've been implementing this in my food regimen and in people who I've been helping with their food regimens. Because food is health, right? And so as we began to talk about this, mRNA inferions are those things that are placed specifically in the food deserts, specifically in areas of high concentration, because here's the real issue. And this is why even farmers, if you just Google farmers and this emergency that I've been talking about, when you start to interview the farmers themselves, when you call a farmer who has had to cut their yield or have been paid to burn their food or have had to throw away 400,000 potatoes, then when you talk to those farmers, you will hear that they were saying, why would we do that? Why would we just give the food away for free to people who were starving? Well, that's just a common situation. But the bigger issue is, since the Industrial Revolution began, the farming revolution has ended. And that was at the turn of the 19th century. And we produced roughly 50% of our foods in America, meaning that every food that we ate, 1 out of 2 foods came from us here in America. 1 out of 2 workers worked in the agricultural infrastructure. Since then, only 2%. And so if we're in a situation of emergency, where we're in war, where money collapses, any of those things, and food, 98% of the food has to come from somewhere else, and we only have 2% of the food, when in the turn of the century, the 19th century, we had almost half of the people that we have now in America, but we created half of our food and we still had starvation during the Great Depression. What could happen if we only have 2% of our food and we have more people? You see, so the math just doesn't add up. And this is why I'm telling you for at least 3 months to store up to store up your food. Genesis, when you read Genesis 41, um, the king not only understanding what was to come, he promoted Joseph to being the second person in charge in the kingdom because food was that important. Not the armies, not their policymakers, not their ambassador and their liaisons, but he promoted him in charge of food. And this is what I want to make sure that you're doing, that you have someone in your family who knows food, who has stored up food, and then you are also storing up for your family, right? It's very important. Now, we've named these things and we're going to go from those things we named. You can go back and look at the video again if you missed out on something and make sure you do the research on your own. Now, let's go to the food source. And why is this important? And first, I want to give a shout out to Sister Edith Willis. She's the person who, when I was 7 years old at camp meeting, she taught me these three classes. Parts 1, 2, and 3 of these classes, they were called edible wild plants. And one of the things she would used to say is that you need to know, and on the campgrounds and on the camping grounds where we were in Cassopolis, Michigan, we had the ability to go to the woods and pick 20 to 30 of those foods ourselves so that we can see them. We know what they look like. We know what they taste like. And since 7 years old, I am now 50, I have utilized this practice. And this is what I want to say before I give you the list of things to store up. Because we no longer store 50% of our, we no longer grow 50% of our food. Listen, nature has not said, you know what, since there are no more farmers, we're no longer going to no longer prepare edible wild plants. And I want to bring this into your conscious in case you are behind the curve on saving. Even if you've saved 3 months and it ended up being 3.5 months, that is easy for you, particularly during spring, summer, and fall, to store up on edible wild plants, meaning plants that you can go out in nature and look at and understand. You can begin to store up those into those foods or add to your foods by utilizing these things. And we won't talk about the supplemental pieces of it. We'll talk about that next week. But this week, we want to make sure that we're making sure that you're prepared so that you have the ability to get these foods. Now, here's the first thing. Of the 400,000 different plants, dig this, dig this. Dig this is an old statement. It means understand this. It means pay attention to this. If you're not from my culture, in the words that we use. Dig this. Out of the 400,000 plants, half of them are edible to humans. So as humans, we have 200,000 plants that we as humans can partake on and eat of them as food. They're edible and they grow in the wild. So I want to make that known to us because we live in a world now where processed foods are more important than foods that naturally grow from the farm. That some additive is added to the food. And so I want to make sure that our conscious knows this because it's important that even though this small list of things that I'm going to give you, and this is why I could have just came on and gave you the foods and I would just be done with my Sabbath. Why would we be at the 29-minute mark on this thing if there were some things that I didn't want you to write down to make sure that you had this understanding? And so make sure, and one of the things that you can start with, there's something called the AY Youth Honors. You can go to that, and that will point you to Edible Wild Plants Part 1, Edible Wild Plants Part 2, and Edible Wild Plants Part 3. That is a good beginning to start to begin to understand how to find edible wild plants, why it's important, and the nutrition that comes. And the nutrition that comes from those edible wild plants. Because sometimes you can taste something and it may not be filling, meaning that it's a lot, but because because it's something that God created, it has 100% of its nutrition. And because of that, just taking one bite of it, you may be full for 8 hours. You may have gotten all of the nutrients that you need for the calorie impact sources that you need for your body. I said it first, and I'm gonna even go against the pyramid, and we'll talk about that maybe on a podcast, but not today because we don't want to go too deep into this. Now, um, the thing that I liked about what Pharaoh did as he listened to Joseph, Joseph had an understanding. Now, listen, Joseph admitted to Pharaoh that the information was not coming from him, that it was coming from God. And this is the same thing I want to say to us. The information that God has given me over the years, I'm not actually sharing with you right now. I'm only sharing with what he's telling me to share. So much that the Pharaoh gave Joseph a new name. His name was, I believe, Zephaneth Paniah. Uh, it's just a small detail that I like to share because I like for us to be excited about reading the Bible. One of the things that you want to be centered on during the time of emergency, even though you have your food stored up, is that you want to make sure that you stay centered on the Word, the Bible. Now, here's the brief thing that I was talking about, and that is what food should you store up? I've given you the warnings. So as you take those warnings in, make sure that you put those warnings on top of what the foods you're using, because some of those technologies can still be on these foods in other ways. How they're preserved, how they're stored on the shelf, the packages that they're in, the packages that you might microwave them in, they still can emanate those particular things onto your food, even though they're in their natural state. And one of the things that I want to talk about a little very quickly is to make sure that you have glass as bowls, glass as cups, and maybe even glass as things that you mix some of your things in, so that you don't have those particular chemicals leaching from the items that you drink from, that you're making your food from, or that you're eating from, what's called leach into your food. All right. And so here are some of the examples, and then we're going to end. The examples have to do more with the fact that they have the ability to be stored. The first food is air. Make sure that you're getting your breath in, your breathing exercises in. When we were church side, we used to do a breathing technique. The breathing technique that I used was only a short essence. The gentleman's name is Wim Huff, WIMHUF. And the first form of food by energy is making sure that you have oxygen to your blood. The second food is water. We want to make sure that you have enough water for 3 months, noting that each person should be drinking daily at least half their ounces in their weight. So, for instance, Pastor Rob is 200 pounds. So, I should be drinking at least 100 ounces of water, right? And because of that, I might want to have over that 3 months time nine hundred 9,000 ounces, right? Because that's 9 months. Well, it's not just Pastor Rob in my house. There's my wife. There's my 2 children. I want to make sure that I store up enough water for that 3 months. That's what's healthy. Now, this is what no one else talks about when they store up their food. that most foods that are dry have to have water. And you want to make sure that your water intake is also adhered to, but you want to make sure that your food intake has enough water to be cooked. Now, that has to do with how much food you eat. And that has to do more with math on the food that you're cooking. And that's why I'm telling you to be very, very cautious on the foods that you choose and how much water you choose based on those foods. Because a lot of people will choose more food than they choose water. When already, just by myself, I'm taking almost 9,000 ounces of water over the 9 months. And I have three more people in my family, but the foods may take that amount or more. And so you have to be cognitive of what you're doing as it relates to how you save your water. The other important piece is that outside of air, outside of water, you want to make sure that the foods you store are in a dry place, a place that animals cannot get to, and a place that is sealed. Dry, no animals, and sealed. This way, you have the opportunity to make sure that by the time you need your food, that it has not been eaten by animals. It has not gone bad by mold or mildew, and or it's dry, and because of that, it has not begun to actually start to cook because water was added to it. There are other reasons too, but we won't go into that. So here's a quick list. The quick list of first is water, right? The first was air, the second was water. The third is legumes. Legumes are considered to be beans. Now, there are some beans that have been considered biologically engineered and have a GMO quality to them. Please make sure that you watch out for that. One of the ways that you can tell is that if the beans sprout, that they are real. And so if you take one of the beans, put it in water for sometimes 5 hours up to 4.5 days. If a little sprout comes from that bean, you know that it's real, right? Very simple. Now, here is one of the beans that I want to make sure that you stay away from: soybean. Soybean is a genetically modified bean in America. It was created to create rubber tires. Most people don't know that. And so, in essence, stay away from that. It is a genetically modified organism. The second is rice. Yes, Pastor Rob, you preach on taking real food. And there are a lot of rices that are not real, specifically those who are on your shelf, particularly brown rice. A lot of people don't know that brown rice is dyed brown. Yes, I said it. Brown rice is dyed brown. And so a lot of your rices that are brown are not really, they're just white rice dyed brown. If you see colored rices and they have purples and browns and greens and blacks and off whites, and they're in the bag, they may actually be a real, a real rice. Happy Sabbath to you also, Patrick. And we want to make sure that we're using these rices as a saving point. And you might want to just do the math on serving sizes. One of the things that you want to practice, though, if you have a 15-year-old youngster in the house like I do, you want to make sure that you kind of keep up on the serving sizes that you serve. Like a 15-year-old may actually eat two and a half the serving sizes of what you're eating. Uh, Shalom to you also, Doreen. And you want to make sure that the serving sizes are adhered to. So just because you're saving up per serving size on the packet, you may also want to consider how much the people in your house eat naturally so that they come to a resolution of being full. Because what do we know? That if people feel like they're in an emergency and they feel like they can't eat properly, then it causes them to eat more. And so we want to be very, very centered on that. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is grains. There are some grains that will fill your tummy, and then that's bad for you. And then there are some grains that fill your tummy and they're good for you. And so if it's an instant grain, meaning you can put hot water in it, and that hot water will make it edible in less than about 30 seconds, it's probably something that is a bad grain. There is an alternative grain, that same grain, that you have to kind of boil it for a few minutes. The water comes to a boil, and that grain is actually has the ability to turn into a grain that you can eat. I want to make sure that you add those grains to your regimen of the foods that you're saving. Thank you for loving the presentation. I appreciate it. It's for us. And then here's the thing. I want to make sure that we have flavors. A lot of theorists, when they're telling us what to store, they tell us to store the first three, but they don't tell us to store flavors. And what do I mean by flavors? I'm not an advocate of sugar, and I know that brown sugars, especially, is just another diet sugar. But I want to make sure that we have the ability to add sugars that are natural. There are some sugars that they're actually not sugars. They taste like sugars, and they come from plants. We call them nectars. We call them dried, powdered plant goods. Those particular things can be added to your grains. They could be added to your beans. They could be added to your rice to give them a higher level of flavor, that are natural, that will allow you to enjoy your food. Because just because we're going through an emergency doesn't mean that our food shouldn't be good. And so I want to make sure that we add flavors to it. And the last two are sealed fruits and sealed vegetables, of course, right? The reason that we want to have sealed fruits and vegetables is because we know that we must have our systems need to be washed out, and our systems need the nutrients. Well, you've heard it from us. We've cautioned you on some things that you should take to make sure that you have the ability to get through this emergency that we are calling the time of trouble. And now, as it relates to theological time of trouble, as mentioned in the Bible, do I know if this time of trouble is that? I don't know yet. I can't say that. But I can tell you it's important for us to store up our wax and keep them trimmed and ready for burning. If it's not nighttime in this emergency yet, keep them trimmed and ready for burning. And this is why we're doing it, because we want to make sure that your family has the same state of readiness that our family has. And we're sharing it with you. We hope that you enjoyed this. Listen, you can connect with us at churchoneipsy.com/connect if you have any questions on what I've talked about today, because it was a lot, even though it was just under 45 minutes, and we're trying to keep it to that because we know that a sermon that is classroom session like, where you're taking notes, you might have some questions that you might have after, and we want to make sure that you have the ability to go back and look at the video, but also connect with us directly. And so you can connect with us here. Also, if you need prayer to get through this time that you feel like we're going through, you can connect with us at churchoneipsilani.com/prayer. We will pray with you. And we've always encouraged everyone to have a prayer life of their own, because I am not God. God is God. So that personal connection. But some of us need a sense of hope. Some of us need camaraderie. Some of us need fellowship. And because of that, we understand that, and we look forward to having prayer with you. And here's the decision. Let us know at churchoneipsilani.com/decision if you've decided to store up foods, because we want to make a small group of those individuals who are storing up foods so that we can begin to share with you what we've learned, and vice versa. We want to let you know that we do not know everything about storage, because we've depending on the food source of going to the store. But we want to make sure that because we are storing up, that we have a small community that we interact with, and because of that, We want to be sure that you have the option to interact with us, and for us, vice versa, to interact with you. And some of the times, trading foods during the time. We may be up on some foods that you may not be up on, and vice versa, and we can trade those foods. And having a community that's already in place to trade those foods for, although hopefully local, we look forward to having that community. And finally, as you know, Pastor Lexi and I have opted out of salary from Church One Global, the Church Global. Because of that, almost 100% of the monies go toward the community. And so you can help through Cash App at $Church1 or through Zelle, church1md@gmail.com. This way you'll have the option. Listen, and this is how we want to end. It's important to create a community at a time like this. Listen, I grew up in these communities, and I didn't feel like we were in the particular time that we're about to go through. And if we never go through the time that I've mentioned, it was better to be prepared. You can always use the food. You can always use those things and ration them back into your regular food regimen out of your normal pantry. But it's better to be prepared than not to be prepared. And here's what I want to say to you: God has his people to be prepared, because if his people are prepared, indeed they are peculiar people, because they have taken the steps to keep their lamps trimmed and ready to be burned. Now, listen, if no one's told you they love you, we love you. We're not looking for members of our church. We're only looking for covenant partners, individuals who believe what we are sharing, they want to be aligned with. Not because you have to get baptized, not because you have to be a number in a church, but because you believe that Jesus is above and he's in charge of his kingdom. And if you want to be in that kingdom, I know that my family and I are, that you can join us. Well, remember this: we love you, and Jesus is Lord. Have a happy Sabbath.